Welcome to this third and, alas, final lecture in this year's series of William E. Massey Sr. Lectures in the History of American Civilization. Those of us who have had the privilege of hearing the two previous lectures now know better than ever why Mr. Gore Vidal occupies such an honored place in American literature as surely one of the most admired and surely one of the most influential of American writers, and yet at the same time certainly perhaps one of the most elusive of American writers. Think, if you will, for a moment of the plight of the poor cataloger in the university library in 6 months from now, who is going to catalog Mr. Vidal's lectures. How will he catalog them? Will he catalog them as autobiography? Well, yes. As social commentary? Oh, certainly. As history of the film? Yes. As fantasy? Well, yes. As some particular effervescent combination of all of these? Oh, most certainly, yes. The New England mind, which tends to run in straight lines, finds it somewhat, not to say square lines, finds it rather difficult to deal with such ambiguity. Mr. Vidal, after your second lecture, a New England matron came to me and said, "Doesn't he know that Duluth is not the capital of Alaska? Won't you tell him?" And I said, "Madam, Duluth was capital of Alaska when he was governor of that state." That degree of ambiguity is so characteristic of all of Mr. Vidal's career. How do we pigeonhole him? As a dramatist, as a screenwriter, as a social critic, as a political activist, as a politician, as a novelist, as a historian, or all of the above? He has achieved such distinction in all these fields. He is, according to the New Statesman, America's best essayist. In the field of fiction, Italo Calvino has said that he has brought the novel to a new height. He has brought in the hyper-novel, the novel raised to the square or to the cube. And then going from the sublime to the ridiculous, the audience for his works in history has been vast, including, if I may say so, the President of the United States, who assured me recently that he was reading Lincoln every night before going to bed. He did not say, and I will not say, whether we should blame the excesses of the present administration or credit the triumphs of the present administration to Mr. Vidal and his novel. That ambiguity is there, and that's what made these lectures so very wonderful. That's why we're particularly looking forward to this third lecture, which is titled Lincoln. Welcome with me, Mr. Gore Vidal.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the origins of Lincoln, Nebraska today. Now, what I've done is, this is the third of these lectures, and I've never done anything like this before. I figured out that I have lived through 2/3 of the 20th century and nearly 1/3 of the life of the American Republic, which somebody always says, "What was it like?" And I said, well, it could have been worse, I suppose. So I'm mixing together really my own recollections of growing up and the movies that influenced me and a bit about my family, which has made me rather squirm to be so autobiographical. But it all sort of comes together, I hope. One thing I like about, I was talking to a friend who's a lawyer, he's also a senator in Australia, and we were talking about the greatest moments in our lives. Needless to say, it was neither was sexual, or even a dinner remembered. He was a criminal lawyer, And he said the greatest moment in his life was when he defended and got off a murderer. And they knew he was a murderer, and he had got him off. He said that was so exciting. It was his art form. I said my most exciting moment was in 1972. I bring this up because I'm in Boston. I opened up the Jordan Hall lectures. And somebody from the audience in questions and answers got up and said, how do you explain that of the 50 states in the late election, only one state went for McGovern and the others went for Nixon? And I said, well, I could flatter you and say that we're in the Athens of America. Dutiful applause on that. But I said, actually, since the beginning of the Republic, Massachusetts has been the most corrupt state in the Union, and you know a crook when you see one. I can tell you that was orgasmic for me. What Professor Donnell left out among my busyness is that I am a demagogue. I still have a silver cup. I'm going to have to read this thing. It's like climbing a mountain for me, but I will look up from time to time in order to give an air of spontaneity. And I also do imitations, and I may fall into one of those. I began to turn yesterday into Richard Nixon. I kept thinking, who do I sound like as I was going on? And I was getting deeper and deeper, and they were coming over. My eyes were furtive, and they were coming over the hill with their nets. I still have a silver cup that I won as first prize for sand modeling at Bailey's Beach, Newport, Rhode Island. It was the summer of 1936, and my stepfather and my mother, we were living in the Van Allen house, as my stepfather, with characteristic patience, was waiting for his mother, Emma Burr Jennings Auchincloss, to die, so that he could move into Hammersmith Farm, where the old lady still presided, with 2 liveried footmen and a conservatory that produced out-of-season grapes more beautiful than a Vermeer painting, and about as tasteless. In those days, I was not only the boy airman of the newsreels. If you haven't heard the other 2 lectures, I flew a plane at the age of 10 and became a momentary celebrity as a flyer. I was the boy airman of the newsreels, but I was a Renaissance talent, rather like the Newport-born Clarence King, so much admired by Henry Adams. I drew, I sculpted, I wrote. I read nearly a book a day, and I saw the movies and understood from them the world. As you might guess, I was a royal pain in the ass, a role that I still do my best to fulfill, even now, in the springtime of my senescence. Small talents often come in a cluster, and there are numerous cases of the writer who can draw, and the painter who can write, and the composer who can do logarithms. In youth, I was the repository of a myriad of mediocre talents, and that high summer at Newport, I was in my Gutzen-Borglum phase. And there was a contest for the best creation of a figure in sand, quite a job on a beach almost entirely covered with seaweed and the gelatinous, rotting corpses of Portuguese men of war. I won the prize with a larger-than-life head of Abraham Lincoln. Now, for somebody in my situation, a condition of aging is that one is besieged by biographers. They are almost as numerous and insistent as fundraisers from the Alumni Association of the Phillips Exeter Academy. Who, as shadows lengthen, circles one head like buzzards, when not flying in formation in order to spell out against the sky the somber phrase, estate planning. These buzzard biographers are not all mine, let me quickly say. They are writing about friends and acquaintances. I seldom respond to any of them, as I don't much care for that memory road which diverged for me in a yellow wood so long ago. For me, the yellow brick road still lies ahead, and every buzzard is a bluebird. And if that is not a rainbow that I see before me, then I do have glaucoma. But so much nudging, as it were, has made me think occasionally about myself as opposed to others. In an earlier lecture, I spoke of empathy. Thanks in part to movies, my own empathy was enlarged at the expense of myself. That is why, as a writer, I was seldom ever my own subject. Now, in response to the questioning of scholars, I have succumbed, or I'm succumbing anyway. It's the American writer's disease, the celebration, if not of self, of the facts of one's own sacred story. Whitman was the first to triumph in the field, but he turned the cosmos into himself. But few writers are so titanic. I think that I've always been able to imagine what it is like to be someone else. But now I begin to wonder, what is it like to be me? A figure that keeps cropping up in the lives of others, wearing usually an impenetrable disguise. So if you'll indulge me, I shall give some of my own history, along with that of the Republic, and of course, of its agreed-upon God, Abraham Lincoln. I've started to go through old papers and notebooks, along with the tarnished first prize for sand modeling. And isn't that a nice metaphor for the arts at this end of the century? I have found a notebook in which I have drawn from a photograph the face of Lincoln, and then I wrote beneath it in a reverent, if slovenly hand, "Now he belongs to the ages." What was this all about, Lincoln and I? In our time, the screening of Lincoln has been every bit as inadequate as the prosing of Lincoln. There was the actor Raymond Massey as Lincoln at home in Illinois, quarreling with his wife. And there was the very young Henry Fonda as Lincoln, practicing law and burying quite early in the film Anne Rutledge, a minor blessing. And that was pretty much that. Impersonations by Walter Houston and John Carradine were not truly iconesque. Lincoln was a godlike presence in other films, such as The Littlest Rebel, starring Shirley Temple, a child actress who at the age of 6 sued my friend Graham Greene, who died today, alas. She sued Graham Greene for suggesting that she was a sexual provocateur. To the end of his days, the mention of Shirley Temple and Graham Greene went very white. She won her case against Greene and became American ambassador to Czechoslovakia. I suppose it could have been worse. But one wonders not so idly what sort of a country we might have had if, instead of being bombarded by screen versions of Nelson and Napoleon and Queen Elizabeth, we had been given films about Jefferson and Hamilton and the Lincoln presidency. Certainly, the agon between Jefferson and Hamilton that has continued for 2 centuries now is of enduring fascination to anyone who finds our republic at all interesting. For a number of reasons that I shall address, I doubt if we shall now ever get the mythical works that we need. And by myth, I do not mean falsified or romanticized history so much as those tribal narratives that define the prospect, much as the Western light gave a certain beauty to those silent films where the director dared not photograph anyone at noon because so full, fierce a light distorts features. Yet if Lincoln was so inadequately screened, why did Lincoln preoccupy me? Well, I was brought up in Washington, D.C., and there was the temple, of course, at the heart of the city. Once I got interested in Rome and Greece at a very early age, thanks to two movies, Roman Scandals and The Last Days of Pompeii. I only liked the highbrow films. I used to haunt that part of Washington, imagining myself in ancient Rome. Now, when I visit what has become a Disneyland federal theme park, I imagine myself in ancient America. So long ago does our republic seem to me. I also remember when they were building the nearby memorial to Jefferson. First I liked it, but then when they set up that crude statue, I took against the enterprise. Much as I've always taken against Jefferson the man, whom I find disagreeable in his sanctimonious hypocrisy, as opposed to Jefferson the God, who gave us the idea that it was legitimate to pursue happiness in a present which, Jefferson said, belonged to the living. This was a novel concept in a sectarian society such as ours, where human life is a mere vale of tears to be endured in preparation for an eternity of bliss. Now is now, was Jefferson's view, and now is all there is for us ever now. I do not know to what extent Jefferson consciously influenced my beloved Alexander Herzen, but Herzen's famous rhetorical question, from the other shore, as it were, is the essential Jefferson. Do you truly wish to condemn the human beings alive today to the sad role of caryatids supporting a floor for others someday to dance on? I would like to have seen that Jefferson screened, Hamilton as well. But so far the screen is dark and we have no electronic Virgil, much less Homer. We don't even have a Parson Weems. We have only the rich and famous, and they have lifestyles rather than lives. Of the members of my family, I was closest to my grandfather, Senator Gore, a blind man from the age of 10, because I had to read to him when periodically my grandmother wore out. She read beautifully in a low, rather melodious southern voice. She also read without the slightest attention to the matter of what she was reading. We used to gather round whenever she read of some bloody murder, her mind far away as the awful details fell gently from her lips, like gardening hints. Occasionally she would rebel, and if no secretary was at hand, I would be sent for. I would read, then the old man would talk about everything. I can't remember much that Senator Gore, came from Mississippi, had to say about Lincoln. He also invented Oklahoma, from which he was the senator. He did talk about Lincoln's son, Robert. He and Robert had been friends, and Robert told him that he and his father had never got on very well. Then a constituent from Oklahoma came to Washington. Could Senator Gore arrange a meeting with Robert Lincoln? She was writing a book about his father, the president. Always dutiful when it came to the constituency, my grandfather gave the woman and Robert Lincoln lunch. Mr. Lincoln, she said, I have absolute proof that your father was the illegitimate grandson of John C. Calhoun. That was the last my grandfather ever saw of Robert Lincoln. Although T.P. Gore was a Mississippi populist who had kept the faith, he was by no means provincial in his taste. He was also not superstitious. When his father became a Campbellite, a form of relatively intellectual fundamentalism, Gore not only refused to follow his father into the Campbellite church, but declared himself an atheist, and so remained to the end of his days. Needless to say, he did not share this secret with the voters of Oklahoma. I took after him. In one of our sessions, I was shocked to find, I guess I'd already been struck by the Lincoln virus, I was shocked to find that my grandfather had no high opinion of Lincoln's prose. when I recited the Gettysburg Address for him rather proudly, he took me back of the music to the sense of the speech which appalled him. Lincoln was celebrating the men that he had caused to die in a war of his own making to preserve a union of states that did not choose, a number of them, to be united. As for government of, by, and for the people, that was perfect nonsense, and Lincoln knew that it was. When I asked him, rather irritably, what politician's style he did admire, he said unexpectedly, John Bright. Bright was a political master of the House of Commons in the year of my grandfather's birth, 1870. A true liberal in the old American sense, Bright stood with the working classes in the battle for reform. Bright's phrase, a free breakfast table, became our no free lunch. Bright hated war as much as did Senator Gore, and Bright's speech against the war in the Crimea is almost as memorable as that of Pericles' belated report to the Athenians. My grandfather knew much of it by heart. The angel of death has been abroad throughout the land. You may almost hear the beating of his wings. I often wondered what effect this 1855 speech had on Lincoln, who certainly knew it, though he died before John Bright had formulated that unquestionable truth: force is not a remedy. From the screen Lincoln of my childhood, I learned of Dr. Mudd, who had lived not too far from where I lived at Marywood in Virginia. Mudd tended the ankle of John Wilkes Booth the night he shot Lincoln and was duly punished for his good deed. Even though there was so little of Lincoln screened, I've always had the sense that I had been present at the Cooper Union speech delivered on Lincoln's way to Exeter to see his son, or as the son put it, on his way to the White House by pretending to visit his son while presenting himself to New England's voters. I can also visualize the first and second inaugural addresses, but that is thanks to Matthew Brady. And then over and over again, I see the cemetery at Gettysburg, I see Ford's Theater, and the gun, and the slow train west. I did read Carl Sandburg's 6-volume scrapbook about Lincoln, but these books made less impression on me than the face of Raymond Massey on the screen, or that of Henry Fonda pleading with his townspeople not to lynch someone without due process. I am not a devotee of the director John Ford, but he and his cameraman achieved a moment at the picture's end which still demonstrates that the right picture can be equal, almost, to the right word. Fonda has won a legal case. He is thanked by the young couple he has saved. They go. A villager remains. A storm threatens. Ain't you going back, Abe? Fonda shakes his head. I think I might go on a piece, he says, maybe to the top of that hill. He is wearing a frock coat and the stovepipe hat with which the national icon is associated. As Fonda climbs the hill, the camera is behind him. At the top of the hill, there's a reverse angle shot with the camera below him. The medium-sized actor suddenly appears tall, elongated, a sort of engraving upon the cloudy sky. There's lightning now and thunder. The figure pauses, as if considering whether or not to take shelter. Then he turns to the left at the top of the hill and walks straight into the storm. And it is no longer a shadowed light that we see upon the screen, but Lincoln himself, reduced to an essence in a fatal storm. The year of that film's release was the great year for movies, 1939. By 1944, I was a 19-year-old warrant officer in the Army of the United States, with a commission as first mate aboard an Army freight supply ship. Why was the boy airman of yesteryear not an Army flyer? Acute myopia had grounded, or rather set me afloat. On a bright autumn day, we boarded a troop ship in Seattle, an Army band played the trolley song from the film Meet Me in St. Louis, a song that even then I associated with Walt Whitman. I was no longer the fearless boy airman of 1936 who had so blithely endured the submarine-infested North Atlantic. I was a writer, able to imagine his poignant death at sea, or indeed just about anywhere else. The fact that we had been issued winter gear, we were not told where we were going. The fact that we had been issued winter gear suggested the South Pacific. But I knew somehow that Alaska would be my destination. Alaska and beyond, to the Aleutian Islands and the icy Bering Sea. I was assigned to Army Freight Supply Ship 35. We operated out of Chernovsky Bay on the island of Amnak. Once a week we sailed with passengers and supplies to Dutch Harbor and back. At Dutch Harbor I saw every movie shown in a large wooden warehouse. As Walt Whitman remarked, the true story of a war is never told by anyone who was there. I shall merely note in passing that in that womanless society with only intelligent ravens for company, the vision of the founder of the Los Alamos Ranch School was made incarnate. If you haven't heard the other two lectures, you will not know what the reference is, but I leave that sort of thing to William S. Burroughs. Now you'll get a hint. Who amongst us would want to hear of polymorphic perverse sex beside the Bering Sea, where we might closely analyze Lincoln's fiat monetary system as devised by Salmon Portland Chase? The death of Franklin Roosevelt was hugely screened while I was in the Army hospital at Anchorage, recovering from overexposure to the elements in this case, not the media. First we heard it on radio, then the movies, and then it was confirmed upon the screen. It seemed impossible that this larger-than-life King Kong of a politician was gone. I was delighted, of course. He'd got us into the war. He'd established a dictatorship. He had defeated my grandfather in the election of 1936. He was also the only president that I could remember, and I was bored to death with him. As the years passed, I naturally came to admire Roosevelt's New Deal, if only for the wonderfully messy, improvisatory nature of the thing. There was no plan. There was no New Deal or any deal at all, except a very wily card player. And once he lost a hand, he said, well, let's try again. After the war, I moved back to the Hudson Valley, where I'd been born, and I became a friend of the widow Roosevelt. I also came to know a good bit about the making of that astonishing drama, the Roosevelt saga as viewed from backstage. For instance, the Eleanor Roosevelt screened in the Rose Garden as Franklin is buried is not what it looks to be, a study in wifely grief, but rather it is the rage of Medea. She had discovered that an old mistress had been with her husband at the moment of death. It was my impression that Eleanor admired the president, but disliked the husband. Whatever their personal feelings as actors, they were forever co-starred in the conscious and unconscious minds of every American, and they themselves were quite aware of their own proto-fictiveness. In Eleanor's coolly unsentimental memoir, she describes the train ride north from Georgia with the president's body aboard, and how the long line of mourners beside the track reminded her of Lincoln's funeral train. Thus, Lincoln continued to haunt us all, including another presidential widow, who would insist on recreating as much as possible Lincoln's funeral. Not an easy thing to do without Lilac or Lincoln. At the scene in the Rose Garden, she told me that they had not yet read the president's will. Later, she was startled to read that he wanted to be buried in a coffin with one side open. Since she hadn't known this at the time, he lies to this day in a standard coffin. Why she wanted to know the open side? I knew the answer. Indeed, I know the answer to a question that puzzled the family. The president wanted to get back into circulation as quickly as possible. And what better way than for his molecules to be incorporated immediately into his own rose garden or Roosevelt? She thought I might be right. She herself was not one to dwell on death or the afterlife, and she was deeply annoyed by the Dutch Queen Wilhelmina, who spent so much of her time talking to the dead through a medium. One will be dead for so very long oneself, said Eleanor, that I cannot see why one should waste one's time talking to them now. In due course, in her own lifetime, Eleanor saw herself memorably screened. This was 1960, the year I ran for Congress in that district. I'd come to Hyde Park to discuss political strategy with Eleanor. Suddenly, there was the actress Greer Garson standing before us. She was dressed in turn-of-the-century clothes and wearing enormous false teeth in imitation of Eleanor's own renowned choppers. Do I look all right, the actress wanted to know. Oh, yes, yes, Mrs. Roosevelt squeaked her approval. Such a nice dress, too, so much nicer than any I ever wore. But all the time that Eleanor was speaking, she was staring with fascinated horror at the actress's mouth, crowded with huge teeth. Finally, mercifully, Miss Garson retired. Eleanor was reflective. Must movies be quite so realistic, she asked. Surely my teeth are not so very large. I told her that Miss Garson's makeup was simply a caricature of the original, who was in life actually, and in her own way, beautiful. That same year, 1960, I screened my grandparents for the television audience in a play called The Indestructible Mr Gore. The senator was dead by then, but my grandmother lived. The play was about their courtship, during which he was accused of making a blind girl pregnant. Quite a trick. He was a blind boy and she was a blind girl. But he was framed. Thanks to this scandal, he lost an election for Congress, but he won my grandmother. William Shatner, who later discovered Star Trek, played my grandfather. And I played myself, the grandson narrator from the future. The play was popular, but then as storage space has always been at a premium with NBC, they destroyed the tape. Even so, I was pleased to have screened one small bit, trivial but to me important, small bit of American history that was accurate in every detail. Then the senator's brother told me with bitter joy that of course T.P. Gore had knocked up the blind girl and that their mother had adopted the resulting child. So history is not easy, whether screened or prosed. Throughout my youth, I seldom mentioned my family in school or in the army or among the literary people that I met. After my third novel, The City and the Pillar, it was thought that I was a farm boy from Virginia who had made good as a professional tennis player and part-time prostitute. I quite liked having people believe this. Certainly my backhand was much feared. The reason for pretending to ordinariness had much to do with the kind of truthful realism so much admired then. By and large, serious fiction was the work of victims, portraying victims for an audience of victims who, it was assumed, would want to see their lives realistically portrayed. No one serious would dream of writing about our rulers or victimizers, because what truly serious writer would have known or would have wanted to know them? For better or worse, this has been pretty much the main line of the Anglo-American novel, from the artful George Eliot down to the not-so-artful present. For me to use the world that I came from would mean that what I wrote would look to be very like the fantasy or daydream narratives of bestsellerdom. In time, I would take the risk, but unluckily for me, to be a true success in this line, the author must know as little about his subject as the reader. They are then as one in imagining together a Marilyn Monroe, say, that never was. The only reality required by popular fiction is that the description of luxury goods with brand names be precisely rendered. I turned from the world I knew to invent other worlds. I made Duluth the capital of Alaska. I also began to relive past times before my birth, before indeed that of the Republic, which has never ceased to be my subject. I suppose it was inevitable that someone who had seen so many movies would eventually make them. As I needed money, I began to write plays for live television. This collective art form flourished from 1950 to 1960. As an hour-length play was acted, it would be photographed by 3 cameras. This meant that one wrote for the cameras as much as for the actors. I enjoyed myself very much. For one thing, the whole country watched these plays. Unfortunately, the programs were controlled by advertising agencies, and there was heavy censorship. Even so, I managed to write one play about a man who kills somebody like Joe McCarthy out of a disinterested sense of justice. It was during this time in television that I was confronted at first hand not only with the famous blacklist, but with the fierce way that censorship was and is exercised in our free country. A self-styled light to the world in general, and to Asia in particular, that Korean season. At the time, we believed that the brutal censorship was simply the result of a red-baiting maverick senator from Wisconsin. Actually, as we now know, the weather was being generated from the newly established national security state presided over by Harry Truman, who had introduced the Federal Employee Loyalty Act in 1947. 6.5 million Americans were obliged to submit to this humiliating oath. We were losing the old republic, but that sort of news spread slowly. To say that I was politicized by all of this would be wrong. In a sense, you cannot politicize the political. I knew how politics worked. I never became a communist or even a socialist, except in my sympathies, because I knew that subscribing to any ideology would be pointless in a country so organized as ours. For instance, there has never been and never can be a labor party in the United States, because organized labor has been both harassed and demonized by government and media. So unless you wanted really to overthrow the state, communism was for me an exercise in group therapy at best, a sort of political orgone box at worst. I know exactly how Bush of Mesopotamia sees the world, because I see it as he does. I was at Exeter when he was at Andover, and we saw all the same movies. But Bush has never questioned anything of this screened view of our history as he scrambled up the conventional ladder, while I shoved the ladder to one side and I drifted off into the vision thing. The world that George Bush and I were shaped by was one where there were many elections, but few, if any, politics. Occasional disagreements over matters of war and peace were determined not by the electorate, but by the money power, and those who ritually served it, and as ritually, I sometimes think, opposed it. For our generation, the overthrow of the Japanese in the Pacific and the Germans in Europe was inevitable. Next, inevitably, we would take on an authoritarian, or was it totalitarian ideology, communism, and the satanic empire that it had spawned where once was Holy Russia. All of this has been so intensely screened during the last half-century that any suggestion that we have never known what we were doing is sure to be ridiculed. Meanwhile, our genius for the metamorphosis of mere fact has achieved perfection. The war in the Persian Gulf was one thing on CNN and quite another thing in the European press. What it was in actual fact, we may never know. All we do know is that what our government wanted to screen was screened, and all else was off camera and so non-existent. Could we have lost the war? We may never know, one way or the other. The first time that the screening of history became truly fabulous was after we lost our long and pointless war in Vietnam. This defeat, screened daily on television, was then metamorphosed into a total victory in the Rambo movies, films that had not only convinced everyone that we had somehow, thanks to Mr. Stallone, won that war, but films that made almost as much money at the world box office as we had wasted on the war itself. In the end, he who screens the history makes the history. If I were a would-be foreign conqueror of the United States, my cry to my hordes would be, Hollywood delenda est. If I could not destroy Hollywood, I would buy it, as the Torah folks just did. Screenwriting has been my second career for about 40 years. By and large, my generation of writers did not become school teachers. If we needed money, we took a job at Columbia, the studio, not the university. But what I began out of financial need, I have persisted in out of fascination. In a sense, the movies lost their singular power when television was invented. The screen was literally shrunk, and what had once been a rare, exciting, vast spectacle screened in the dark of an exotic palace became a small, prosaic moving picture made up of 1,000 lights behind the glass of a household appliance. Thus, history is daily screened for us by network and cable news programs. I suspect that our view of the world is now even more controlled and limited than it was of the Russian Oblomov and his coffeehouse friends. Also, where a Russian on Tsarist days or communist days could always tell when government censors had been at work on the text of a newspaper, we have no idea at all what happened or did not happen in those Middle Eastern deserts. We also have no idea, it's quite interesting lately, whether we've ever been paid any compensation for that war. Compensation, of course, is a euphemism for extortion. As for the screening of our past, it is rarely done. When it is attempted, the aim of the exercise is to teach simple patriotism to a people become so heterogeneous that many of them have little or nothing in common with one another, including often the English language. Plainly, it is not easy to inculcate patriotism when there is no agreed-on patria. From the beginning of my career as a dramatist, I was drawn to politics and to religion, the only two subjects that Bernard Shaw thought worth our attention, and of course the two subjects absolutely forbidden us, not only in the popular arts, but in the public schools as well. Public schools do not give us our history. Instead, they try, nobly but futilely, to indoctrinate their charges in good citizenship. As each minority gains economic power, it is discussed in admiring terms. This is very good civics, but it is hardly history or even politics, since a text with no context is meaningless. Periodically, effort is made to present our founders as gods. These efforts fail. Lately, ordinary families have taken to tracing their roots as far back into history as they can go. They also hold annual get-togethers to discuss their findings. Recently, I attended Gore Day in Mississippi, where I gazed with considerable anguish upon 200 variations of my own nose. It is humbling to realize that one's nose, persona two, is just a bit of genetic encodement temporarily housed in a somewhat haywire molecular envelope, soon to be dispersed with relief, if I may strike the plangent personal note. My seventh cousin, I am told, Albert Gore, the future president, stayed away on my account. I disapprove of his fearsome wife, Tipper, the scourge of the First Amendment. This year there will be a reunion of my grandmother's family, the Kays, where I shall encounter a seventh cousin, new to me, Jimmy Carter. So what the tribes cannot get in the schools, they now seek through genealogy and through the web of kinship. There's something not only touching, but primal in this coming together of blood kin. But touching or not, this Homeric reversion to tribal life is no way to inspire a country, or perhaps the better verb would be to invent a country. When I wrote for television, I was able every now and then to comment on power as exercised in the Great Republic. Then I moved to Hollywood, where I wrote movies for MGM. As one always had more freedom in writing about the past, that is, if the past was not American, I took to writing such gorgeous junk as Ben-Hur. Here, at least, I was able to present the serious Tiberius of Tacitus rather than the scurrilous caricature of Suetonius. My Tiberius was like the hard-working but totally ineffectual chief executive of a lousy company like Chrysler. This was a breakthrough in screened history. In due course, I wrote plays that were staged on Broadway. One of them was called The Best Man, about a contest for the presidency between a man with a virtuous public life and a messy private life, and a man with a vicious public life and a private life beyond reproach. A former president acts as chorus and referee. The play was a success. The studios began to bid for the screen rights. At last, I would be able to make my own movie. Now, what follows is a paradigm of how rigidly our history and our politics are screened for us, and how seldom anyone is allowed to reveal anything as it is. United Artists bought the film rights. I'd be producer as well as writer of the screenplay. Then it was announced that the great Frank Capra would produce and direct. As I noted yesterday, I never liked his political films. Even at 12, I knew too much about politics to be taken in by his corny Mr. Smith Coming to My Town. Capra's movies usually pitted the good guy, Jimmy Stewart, to be admired because he's been elected to the Senate without understanding politics, against the bad guys who want to build a dam when what the folks really need is a new river or something like that. What was I to do with Mr. Capra? My play was unusual. It was not only political, but it was accurate. Although my friend Jack Kennedy did say to me, when you're running for president, you don't have all that time to sit around discussing the meaning of it all. Plainly, the vision thing is a hang-up of writers. Frank Capra was and is an engaging and lively Sicilian American, but age had made Capra, if possible, more sentimental than he had been in his youth. I'd already lost 2 films based on my work, The Left-Handed Gun and A Visit to a Small Planet. In each case, the wrong director had made the wrong film. I was not about to lose a third one, but how to get rid of Capra? The French auteur virus had already infected Hollywood, and dozens of brothers-in-law of producers who had spent years locked up on sound stages with actors nobody wanted to talk to were now being treated as if they were singular creators, so many Leonardos sprung from the good earth of the San Fernando Valley. Of these auteurs, Capra was an acclaimed master. Capra and I discussed the script a number of times. The realism of the piece did not impress him, because for him politics was not what it is, but what he himself had screened. As William Wyler studied not Roman history, but other Roman movies in preparation for Ben-Hur, so Capra tried to conform my, to him, disagreeable realism with the screened America that he was used to and that he had in fact helped create. Once again, the story was to be about the good guy who speaks for all the little people. Suddenly Capra was inspired. Let's open this up, he said. At the convention on the first day, our good guy will get Stewart, get maybe Fonda. He goes out into the crowd where all these little people are, you know, the delegates. I pointed out that between the Secret Service and the press, this was not only not done by the candidates, but not doable. Oh, we'll find a way. He was very confident. The point is, he gets out there among the ordinary people and he talks straight to them. What, I asked, masking my inner despair, does he say to them that's going to be so important? Capra was radiant in his vision. He quotes Lincoln to them. I pointed out that Lincoln quotations probably wouldn't win anyone any votes that year. Certainly they would not amuse the blacks who were in rebellion. This was 1963. But Capra was exalted. He'd also visualized the scene. Now then, get this. He dresses up as Abraham Lincoln. Then he gives them the Gettysburg Address or something. I said that I thought that this was truly inspired. Then I went to United Artists, and I got Capra off the movie and put myself in control. I then picked a pair of bright young producers to produce and hired a director who had worked for me in television. Henry Fonda played the lead without once resorting to the stovepipe hat that he had worn with such magical effect in young Mr. Lincoln. Those who would like to know Frank Capra's version of this story, I've just told you, will find that in his memoirs. In any event, I was able that once to screen our politics the way they are, or were, as of 1963. The picture was entirely mine, I thought, until I got to the Cannes Film Festival, and there was a big advertisement that says, "The best man, un film de Franklin Schaffner." But I had pulled it off once, and that was quite enough, I mistakenly thought. I returned contentedly to novel writing. I made Alaska into Duluth time and again, also Myra Breckenridge into Myron and back again. I meditated on our history and wondered how best to portray it. I chose a method that has been somewhat controversial, to resort to understatement. I was aware that I would cause distress among those tenured bureaucrats for whom American history is a profession rather than an art. I also anticipated the problems that I would have in trying to keep to what looked to me to be the main track in our history. As Lincoln is the national god, he is always being kept up to date. Although a Unionist in life, he must be made to seem an abolitionist, and though a Whig Republican, he must be made to seem an of, by, and for the people Democrat. The result has been several tons of badly written history and a curiously blurred figure on the screen of the national consciousness. In life, Lincoln wanted to colonize the ex-slaves in Central America. During the 1960s, this was not godlike. So a number of Lincoln priests in the universities were able to prove to their satisfaction that he had been an integrationist as well as an abolitionist all along. In the God business, it is Proteus, finally, who prevails. Originally, I had planned to write around Lincoln. Suddenly, to my surprise, the television magnates asked me to dramatize Lincoln for the small screen. As often happens, by the time that I'd done my work, no one wanted to screen any American history. So I incorporated the Lincoln presidency into my chronicle of Burr, 1876, Lincoln, and so on. Despite the success of this particular book, I was told by the head of a network that the American audience is not and never will be interested in the life of Abraham Lincoln or in the Civil War. They want only stories of today. Eventually, others dramatized my Lincoln book, and the result was popular with public and press. It was also unpopular with the Lincoln priests, who then put their considerable weight behind a documentary on the Civil War, where Lincoln as Unionist and colonizer of the ex-slaves would be downplayed. I have not seen the result, but it has made my old friend Shelby Foote a star at 73. Although English imports now fill the cabled air with hundreds of hours devoted to the likes of the dim Duke of Windsor, our history still remains unscreened. Privately, the network programmers say that as history is barely taught in the public schools, there is not much of an audience for strange stories about long-dead people who wrote with feathers. There is something in this. Also, more to the point, we are a sectarian nation, and our warring sects can erupt at any moment. The black population always got the point to the slave-owning Virginia founders, which means that our history, properly screened, is a potential hornet's nest. I often upset professional keepers of the national myths with the phrase, the agreed-upon facts. I would have thought that this was a reasonably careful way of saying that there are not many facts of any kind that we can ever be sure of. And since endless disputes over this or that detail will bring to a halt any description of earlier times, there is almost always a general, often exhausted, consensus that Lincoln, say, appears to be on record as thinking that if slavery is not an evil, then nothing is evil. And so he might be thought of as an abolitionist in his heart, if not his politics. Naturally, some agreed-upon facts are more agreed upon than others. But these imprecise consensuses are all that we have. Certainly the notion that with sufficient graduate students under a professor's magisterial direction, the actual true story of a life lived long ago can be told is nonsense. Even those lives that took place entirely in the age of newsprint and television tapes and oral histories can never be more than guessed at. Who tells the truth? Who knows the truth? What is the truth? The New York Times is always regarded as an authoritative primary source. But the Times often presents as facts fantasies that no one in good faith could ever accept, unless he shares the narrow sectarian worldview of the editors. Since I have been occasionally fictionalized by that paper, I keep them at a distance. My last encounter was typical. The interviewer's opening words to me were, "You hate the American people, don't you?" I said, "No, I hate the New York Times." And the two are not the same. I then turned to the photographer and his assistant, and I got them to sign a statement to the effect that the interviewer, not I, had said that I hated the American people. All in all, a very curious thing to pretend that a populist had said, particularly one who had made those same people his life's work. But the New York Times is a reckless paper when dealing with those who question its values. Hence, it is a primary source to be used with caution. Since I have been written about, perhaps a bit more than most historians, I am not as impressed as they are by what I see in print, no matter how old and yellow the cutting. Obviously, each of us has his prejudices, and no one can ever claim to purity in the interpretation of those facts to which he has chosen to agree. But this does not mean, as I am said to have said and did not say, that history is fiction. I only suggest that much of what we take to be true is often seriously wrong, and the way that it is wrong is often more worthy of investigation than the often trivial disagreed-upon facts of the case. Why nations choose some myths to live by and not others brings us to the great proposition of Alfred North Whitehead, who said that it is what a given society does not say about itself that most defines and illuminates it. About once a decade, at the dark of the moon, someone will timidly note that there is a class system in the United States. Promptly a booming chorus, rather like the old Don Cossack choir, then starts to thunder across the land as the employees of the ruling class and the schools and the media chant their denial that such a horror could ever exist in a land where the only discrimination at all is perhaps against the poor man who wins the lottery, a bit of class prejudice easily remedied when the capital gains tax is repealed. Agreed upon or disagreed upon facts to one side, it's significant that Jefferson liked the wonderful phrase, true facts. There are times that you just can't figure out what is going on in Jefferson's mind. I like untrue facts. There's another handicap that the custodians of our history labor under. They don't understand politics, yet they write about politicians. Recently, a Hungarian-bred American schoolteacher took me to task. He was upset, and he wrote to the general public, "Vidal's is the most influential Lincoln image of our time. It is also the most insidiously ahistorical." I think ahistorical in this context means a lack of footnotes. I also like the way he uses the word image, as if taking for granted that one must only deal in the images of things and not in their reality. But it's not my alleged errors that disturb him so much as the, quote, cynical, amoral world the book creates, with a comfortable Lincoln at its center. This is surely the worst literary blow against Lincoln's reputation on record, and to a Watergate-tempered generation all too acceptable. I noted the historian's provenance as Stalinist Hungary because the style is very much that of a defender of a totalitarian regime. Yet surely the point to Lincoln, or to any leader of a country such as ours, is that he must deal at all times with corruption of every sort. And if he's not comfortable in this line of work, he should try something else. It would be nice, said the Speaker of the House, gazing upon the professors that Jack Kennedy had brought to Washington, if just one of them had been immoral to a school teacher in Gettysburg. But what he takes to be cynicism on my part is simply realism. As for amorality, the word is so relative in its meaning and so random in its application that one should be wary of using it at all. Actually, what our governors once screened for the masses are heroic morality tales that will so inspire and distract them that they will surrender their tax money in order to maintain an empire profitable to the few and ruinous for the many. I would suggest that our icon dusters ponder the cynicism and amorality back of the political system and investigate that if they dare. But the true nature of any political arrangement is one of Whitehead's illuminating non-subjects, and any attempt to deal with it causes distress in a society where what ought not to be is not. Even so, despite my tendentious nature, I think that I've been tactful in not imposing my own views where they do not belong. Now, since George Bush and I were brought up on the same movies and newsreels, I think I'm often seized by prophecy, so here I feel one coming on now. I think I can tell what he would like to do next, though a country with a collapsing banking system is not exactly the best launching pad for a would-be Trajan. Bush sees himself as avatar to Roosevelt and Churchill. He sees this tiny little island, well, this actually fairly large country, comprising but a third of a continent, as the center of a world empire where everyone will do what we tell them to do because we're stronger than they are. It is also a lot of fun to order people around, and there may even be some money in it if we can periodically blackmail countries richer than we are. At the time of the Spanish-American War, Mark Twain proposed that we replace our flag with the Jolly Roger. Now here it is again, old skull and bones, at twilight's last gleaming. For George Bush, it is always 1939. The year of the Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, and young Mr. Lincoln. It is the year that Hitler invaded Poland, that Japan was conquering China. It was the year when that magnificent windbag Churchill was speaking up for war, and that truly amoral and cynical and brilliant politician Roosevelt was trying simultaneously to get us into the war while carefully keeping us out of the war. This sort of statesmanship deeply puzzles school teachers in Gettysburg, where one is either great and good and always right or not. Bush sees himself in this heroic line of the great and the good and the right. But the world of the 90s does not resemble in any way the 30s. There is no Hitler, no Stalin. There are no regnant ideologies other than our own, which is consumerism. There is no enemy of all that is good in the human race, unless it be the United States, or at least that military, industrial, political combine that has locked us all up inside a national security state and thrown away the key. Although George Bush does not like to read books, I'm happy he's now got around to Lincoln, but he did say in the last New Hampshire primary that he was in that being president is a lot harder job than reading a Gore Vidal novel. I wish it were so in his case. As it is, he will try for further military victories. But if the Germans and the Japanese don't pay our bills, then the last best hope of Earth will be obliged, under a new president, perhaps political system, to repair our broken state and forego international piracy of the sort that we're lately prone to. What sort of country is the United States, and what should it be? In the interest of pluralism, every minority is to be cherished, that is a given. But the view of the world that we have inherited is the work of white male capitalists, and is that not a limitation? Of course it is. Many of our Spanish-speaking citizens or part-time citizens have no plans to learn English. Is this good or bad? Should they be allowed to vote or not? I have no answer to this problem other than to point out that in human affairs there are always two great forces at work. One is centrifugal, away from the center. The other is centripetal, a coming together at the center. We see both forces loose in the world today. The nation-state of Lincoln and Bismarck is disliked by most of those people who have been confined to them. The Scots don't much like their union with the English, the Basques with the Spanish, and so on to the Soviet Union, which is undergoing a series of centrifugal shocks. Even so, I think that a balance can be struck between these two opposing forces. Each tribe should have as much autonomy as it wants. Each tribe should also be encouraged to join with other tribes in larger units, like the European Common Market, in order to form a more perfect economy and environment. Switzerland is always derided by us because we have so much to learn from them. And the first thing that this ramshackle nation-state of ours might study with profit is the Swiss cantonal system that gives every sort of freedom to 4 tribes with 4 languages and 2 religions. I have some personal interest in the Swiss arrangement, as my father came from the Alpine province of Romana Raetia, which has produced not only its own minority race and language, but has made a serene accommodation with the rest of Switzerland. No, we Ladinishers did not produce the cuckoo clock, but the triple diphthong yodel is ours. I suspect that the United States might study with profit the Swiss arrangement, and then accept the fact that much of the southern tier of our country will be forever Spanish. On the other hand, for a reactionary American like myself, I react against the empire and in favor of the lost republic and its eroding Bill of Rights. It is hard to know how to respond to the new arrivals, not only from Latin America, but from Asia. Do we force freedom upon them? Do we have the right to order them to accept the Bill of Rights? Or do we let them set up Confucian conclaves within our borders and do triumphantly their own thing? It is usual at this point to mention education. The word is always soothing, suggestive somewhat of ketchup, which makes everything look and taste pleasantly the same. But discussions of education in America always center on money, how to get the money from the Defense Department to the schools. Well, that is a problem. But there is a greater problem that no one seems willing to address. What should a school teach? It is plain that what we teach now is of no great use to anyone, even if what is taught were well taught. Liberal arts means a smattering of everything and not much of anything, while trade schools are thought undemocratic. I have never in my life been so bored as I was in the classrooms at Exeter and at the other schools I went to. Occasionally a good teacher could lift the gloom, and of course there was an education to be got at school outside the class. Even so, it seemed to me as if there was a conspiracy, not only to make one learn things that one did not want or need to know, but worse, to refuse to teach the things that one was eager to find out about. First question I asked when I got to Exeter was, when do we study the Roman Empire? In Latin class. You will translate Cornelius Nepos. Well, what about the French Revolution? What about it? We would be taught no history of any kind other than the appropriately named Muzzy's History of the American People. I never got over the shock. At 14, I had wanted to find out everything that I could about the whole world and its history. Instead, I was subjected to Latin irregular verbs for 4 years. I felt cheated, and I spent my spare time reading about all the things that I wanted to know about, while deliberately refusing to learn anything that the school wanted me to know. I barely graduated, but I got a lot of reading done. I should like for us to abandon our entire educational system as it is now constituted. Deliberately abandon, that is, rather than let it vanish as it is doing through attrition. I would then begin again. I would make history the spine to the mandatory 12 years of state-imposed indoctrination, to give our education its proper name. In the first grade, I would begin with all the theories, scientific, mythical, religious, of the origins of the cosmos and of man. This always fascinates the very young with innumerable big bangs and flashes of lightning. I would then proceed for 12 years to teach, in chronological order, the entire history of the human race, east and west, as well as north and south. Along the way, mathematics and the sciences would naturally enter the curriculum, as they did indeed enter our common history. The delicate issue of sex would be included as part of man's growing knowledge of biology and of the development of medicine. You know, I've always found it curious that the two things a human being must cope with all his life, his body and his money, are never explained to him at school. Few adults ever know where their liver is until too late. And few ever know where their money is until Mr. Keating is arrested. By the last year of school, the young adult would know pretty much where the human race was in time and space and where it had been. This knowledge might even inspire him to show interest in where we are going, or even could go. During the 12 years, those of a scientific bent would be encouraged and various additional courses made available to them. Those interested in the arts would be sternly discouraged from pursuing any arts. I am child of Plato here. This will save many people from lifelong disappointment, while limiting production in the most Darwinian way to the born artist who cannot be discouraged. As for the universities, I would promptly fire any teacher who went to work for the national security state. I hope I have not strayed too far from my theme, which I think I have now forgotten, but since the screening of history, yes. But since future classrooms are bound to show more and more history on films, I am sure that this is a good thing. But then I am a creature of the written word, and I only go to the movies for fun. And where was I when last referred to in these chats? Ah, yes, Alaska. In an Army hospital at Fort Richardson, having been frozen in the Bering Sea, a misadventure which Anais Nin was to find hugely symbolic. Every writer gets the Louise Collet he deserves. I had by then started a novel about a ship in the war in Alaskan waters. After the hospital, I was transferred to the Gulf of Mexico. I was unable to finish this novel until I went to see The Isle of the Dead with Boris Karloff. As Boris Karloff first haunted my imagination in The Mummy, so Boris Karloff, as a Greek officer on an island, at a time of plague, broke, as it were, the ice, and I completed my first book right then and there in Apalachicola, Florida. I have no idea what it was in the movie that did the trick, but then some things are best left to what the surrealists call the night mind, where it is always noon beneath the languorous palm trees of my unscreenable Alaska. I will now, as they call it, entertain questions as best I can. I think they want, for recording devices, this is one of the FBI's insistences is that you speak into the microphone.
Are you possibly exaggerating slightly what you were implying, if not saying explicitly, about Lincoln? And I refer to some recent work by, I believe his name is James McPherson, who's written a book that I don't know whether you read it.
Yes.
And would you perhaps comment on that, if in fact maybe there was some greater commitment, in spite of the way you characterized the colonization question, to abolition? So,
well, McPherson doesn't do much with that. It's a very good book on the war in general. Lincoln specifically spoke as late as August 1864, to his secretary John Hay, and he was still going on about the colonization scheme. Then, of course, Ben Butler says that Lincoln talked to him about it a month or so before he died. Scholars have discovered this was not possible, that Butler wasn't in Washington. The point is that Lincoln, once he got an idea, it's very curious, he never gave it up. It was perfectly impractical. They had made some attempts, but I don't think this is not my imagination at work. The imaginative ones are the ones who changed what Lincoln really was all about. Was it a good notion? Of course it wasn't. But I'm trying to show what he was like, not what I would have done. Yes?
Yes, I have two questions. I read your book, Creation, a few years back, which I truly enjoyed, and I would like to know what your feelings are about that strange fellow Socrates, and whether a fellow like that could survive in our society today. And my second question is that with politicians, do you think we should use the Socratic method, poison?
Well, I must say that was a notion of H.L. Mencken's, that anyone at a convention who did not carry it, any favorite son, be executed at the end of the convention, that he thought that this would clear the air and, make for euphoria. Could Socrates survive today? That is beyond my imagination. He wouldn't be here. He'd be at Berkeley.
Mr. Vidal, I don't have much brains or sitzfleisch, and I'm trying to get ahead in my academic career in spite of these drawbacks. And the only way I've made any progress so far is to ask people to pick their brains. So when David Donald was celebrating his second Pulitzer, I asked him if there were any gay American presidents, since I hadn't read about any in my whole life. And he said, well, one of my students has found out that Garfield had some sort of an affair. And in fact, that dissertation at Hopkins and the most recent biography have agreed that he did. They didn't go into it too extensively. And David said, well, I don't believe that Buchanan was, although most people say so. But we had a session on it at the AHA, and Buchanan's great-nephew was there. And he said, well, my great-aunt would never talk about Buchanan because she thought he liked boys more than he liked girls. That was the best thing that we got in our session. But I was wondering about my friend here, Charlie Shively, has written about Lincoln and spoke about him, that he spent 3 years in bed with some hardware salesman, that he rented this double bed.
He was always frugal.
Yeah. And
that cut the bills on hardware.
That he'd gone across the river, I think you went into it somewhat, and had gotten some sort of disease that most people assume was from a girl, but I wondered if there's any evidence that it might have been from a boy.
Well, this is provocative, I must say. I can only tell you that the sex lives of politicians have an emetic effect on me. The thought of any of them doing anything, I want to lie down. Even a relative, even somebody like Jack Kennedy, I really don't want to know more about it than I pick up. As for I've said earlier, I think yesterday or the day before, it's beginning to blur, but this is the only country in the world that thinks there's such a thing as gay people and straight people. There is no such thing as heterosexual and homosexual. These are adjectives. Nobody can be an adjective. They describe actions. You can certainly commit the actions, but I don't believe in the category. I know it might be interesting to. You forgot George Washington, by the way. There's a whole movement to enroll him under the banner of Sodom. But oh God, I'm getting tired just thinking of George Washington at Valley Forge with a hardware salesman.
Mr. Vidal, at an age of probably more than 1/3 of your 2/3, and having listened to your autobiography over the past few days, I'm led to wonder, was it ever any better? You speak now of a reform of education or our decaying Bill of Rights or a national security state in which the key has been thrown away. But at any point in this glorious youth, was there this Bill of Rights enshrined in perfect working order? Or was there a Jeffersonian moment where, in fact, this was in function? And I guess I wonder, from the point of youth, looking somewhat at you, looking backward, skeptical of the myth of one's own past.
Well, if I were Arthur Schlesinger, I would say, there is this pendulum. You swing back and forth between liberalism and conservatism, Arthur always said. I keep saying, Arthur, watch out, here comes that pendulum. Oh, Arthur, my God, it got him, it finally got him. Was it not always thus? Well, there has always been a struggle of the few against the many against the few. The rights have always been. 1919 was a far worse year for civil rights. That was 6 years before I was born. That was when the Attorney General, Mr. Palmer, went after everybody in sight, and the Secretary of Labor could deport anybody of foreign birth he wanted to without any explanation. Yes, I would say, well, Gene McCarthy, a very perverse man with a nice sense of humor, is not always wrong. He said the Depression, he thought, was the best time in his life, and our lives pretty much parallel. So that was the only time when everything worked. He said a lot of well-motivated people who might have taken up, gone into the useless professions like the law were running the post office. He said everything worked then. People helped one another, and there was a great sense of comity in the land. That's a possibility. It comes and goes. I would say that the national security state, which I think you should really bone up on, is quite interesting, how that has been imposed upon us and how there were no, let's put it this way, when I was young, there were no mandatory blood tests, urine tests, lie detector tests for millions of people because they might be taking drugs, which is no business of the government if they were. I don't find that an advance in civil liberties.
Mr. Vidal, the story goes, I'm not sure whether it's true or not, that upon first mentioning to his cabinet the plans for the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln started off with a joke. And it had something to do with the town of Utica, New York, I believe, and the rest is lost to the ages. As with the rest of Lincoln. More recently, Woody Allen wrote a very, very brief play in which a man travels to Lincoln asking for the pardon for his son who fell asleep on guard duty. And the man gets very nervous and instead asks Lincoln, how long should a man's legs be? And Lincoln replies, long enough to reach the ground. We see that Lincoln seemingly had a certain sense of humor that seems to have been lost as the ages went by. We might find George Bush funny, but then we should remember that looks aren't everything. But how, then, is humor a value for politicians, and how have we kind of lost that as the years go by, and is that something that can be resuscitated with men more successful than Eugene MacArthur?
I had a friend who wrote a book called Presidential Humor, and it was terribly thin, and there was barely a joke in it. The inadvertent ones were wonderful, particularly Jefferson's first inaugural, which has some of the craziest syntax you've ever seen. He always managed to say the opposite to what he means. Lincoln was indeed a great stand-up comic. I mean, descriptions of him working an audience out on circuit in Illinois was extraordinary. It's like Mort Saul used to be. I mean, he really was and he could play off the audience. He'd improvise and go on and on and on. But that is not what the presidency was remembered for. Humor today, I think, is very dicey. One of the reasons most comics make jokes about themselves and their disabilities is they don't dare make fun of anybody else now because everyone's got a union and a letterhead and a lawyer. So various groups have been, for some, I think, quite good reasons, but for others, we've lost many targets of humor, except oneself. I think George Bush is funny. But it's strange, this dysfunction that he has, though, when it comes to speaking. You know, the one thing that we were taught at Exeter, and I suppose Andover was not far behind, was we were pretty fluent. I mean, we were made to write a daily theme, and we had to organize our thoughts, and if whatever you said, they always said, what do you mean? I mean, we were always being pinned down. You couldn't get away with just empty rhetoric. You had to really define what you're talking about. And Bush must have had the same education, and yet to listen to him stammer around, I can only think that as a person who spent his entire life climbing up this ladder in a conventional way, that he's really had to tell so many lies along the way that he can't keep them straight. So he's out there, and somebody's mentioning parity, and he's trying to think, what did we decide about agriculture this morning? Well, it's easier to stammer than to get the wrong answer. I like to think that's why he can't talk very well. But you know, the whole job of the presidency as conceived by the Founding Fathers was not just the bully pulpit of Theodore Roosevelt, but you had to embody the nation, or at least the administration of the nation. Your one great job was the State of the Union, when you reported to the people what their government had done. And this went on till the year 1920. Every president took this very seriously. Some were better at it than others. Theodore Roosevelt wrote miles of state papers, so did Woodrow Wilson. Then, 1920, Wilson leaves office and Harding comes in. Since then, no president has written his own speeches, nor could he write them. Now they're having trouble reading them. And I love the Nixon Library. Apparently has no books in it at all.
Would you comment on the...
On that note, I have
Okay.
orders of the Kennedy School to follow the immediate go home. Thank you very, very much.